I'm Marcus Thompson, 42 years old, and I spent 8 years in maximum security prison for a robbery I didn't commit. 3 weeks ago, I finally walked out of those gates a free man. But the scars of what happened in that courtroom still haunt me. During my trial, I watched in horror as my public defender, the one person who was supposed to fight for my innocence, nodded off repeatedly, his head dropping to his chest while prosecutors painted me as a violent criminal. The security footage that could have proven my alibi. He never requested it. The witness who saw me 20 miles away at the time of the robbery, he forgot to subpoena them. Now I'm about to expose the entire system that failed me, and the people responsible are about to learn what it's like to have their lives destroyed by someone else's negligence. If you've ever felt betrayed by those men to protect you, hit that like button because what I'm about to share will make your blood boil. Life has a way of changing in an instant. One moment, you're hitting the snooze button for 5 more minutes of sleep, and the next, you're watching everything you've built crumble around you. That's exactly what happened to me on March 15th, 2016. I remember waking up that morning at 5:30 a.m., just like every other weekday for the past 12 years. My job as a warehouse supervisor at Henderson Distribution meant early mornings, but I didn't mind. It was honest work, paid decent, and most importantly, it kept a roof over my daughter Kayla's head and food on our table. She was 18 then, just about to graduate high school, and I was so damn proud of her. Honor roll, acceptance letter, 2 state university, the whole 9 yards. I shuffled to the kitchen, started the coffee maker, and checked on Kayla. She was still asleep, her textbook scattered across her desk where she'd been studying late the night before. I smiled, closed her door quietly, and went about my morning routine: shower, shave, uniform, coffee, and a quick breakfast of toast and eggs. The knock came at exactly 6 a.m. Not a normal knock either, the kind that makes your heart skip before your brain even processes what's happening. Heavy, authoritative, the kind of knock that means trouble. Police, open up. My first thought was that something had happened to one of my neighbors. Maybe old Mrs. Rodriguez had fallen again, or there'd been another break-in at the corner store. I opened the door to find 4 officers, hands on their weapons, staring at me like I was some kind of dangerous animal. Marcus Thompson, the lead officer asked. Yes, that's me. What's this about? You're under arrest for armed robbery. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. The words didn't make sense. Armed robbery. I hadn't even had a speeding ticket in 20 years. There must be some mistake, I said, even as my hands instinctively went up. I haven't robbed anyone. I was at work yesterday. I work at Henderson Distribution. You can check. But they weren't interested in checking anything. Cold metal cuffs clicked around my wrists, and suddenly I was being pushed toward the door. That's when Kayla appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Dad, what's happening? The terror in her voice still haunts me. My baby girl standing there in her pajamas, watching her father being arrested like some common criminal. It's okay, baby, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. This is just a misunderstanding. Call your Aunt Patricia. Tell her what's happening. The officers were already pushing me out the door, reading me my rights in that monotone voice you hear on TV. Except this wasn't TV. This was my life falling apart on a random Tuesday morning. They put me in the back of the squad car, and as we pulled away, I saw Kayla standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that I'd be home by dinner, that this was all just some horrible mix-up. I had no idea I wouldn't see her again outside of prison walls for 8 years. At the station, they told me I was being charged with the armed robbery of Chen's liquor store on the south side. Apparently, someone matching my description had walked in the previous evening, around 7:30 p.m., pulled a gun on the elderly clerk, and made off with $3,200 from the register. The clerk, Mr. Chen, had been pistol-whipped and was in the hospital with a concussion. I was at work at 7:30. I kept telling them. I worked the 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift, but I stayed late yesterday doing inventory. I didn't leave until almost 9. Check the time cards, check the security cameras. My supervisor saw me there, but my protests fell on deaf ears. They had their suspect, and as far as they were concerned, the case was closed. The interrogation room was exactly like you see in the movies: gray walls, metal table, uncomfortable chair, and that two-way mirror that made you feel like you were being watched by a dozen people. Detective Morrison, no relation to the public. Defender I'd later be cursed with, sat across from me, a manila folder thick with papers between us. Mr. Thompson, he began, opening the folder. We have a positive ID from the victim. Mr. Chen picked you out of a photo lineup this morning from his hospital bed. He slid a grainy surveillance photo across the table. The image was blurry, showing a black man approximately my height and build, wearing a dark hoodie. You couldn't make out any facial features clearly. Hell, it could have been any one of thousands of men in the city. That's not me, I said firmly. I don't even own a hoodie like that. And look at the timestamp, 7:32 p.m. I was at Henderson Distribution. I was doing inventory with my supervisor, Ray Jimenez. Call him, he'll tell you. The detective made a note but didn't seem particularly interested. Tell me about your financial situation, Mr. Thompson. What does that have to do with anything? Jeff, answer the question, I sighed. I make $52,000 a year. I pay my bills on time. My daughter's starting college in the fall. So yeah, money's going to be tight, but I've been saving for years. I've got about $8,000 put away for her tuition. $8,000, Morrison repeated, making another note. And you're telling me you didn't think about how that $3,000 from the liquor store could help with those college bills? I'm telling you I wasn't there. My voice cracked with frustration. I was at work. I clocked in at 6 a.m. and didn't clock out until 8:47 p.m. That's almost 15 hours. Check the system. Henderson uses electronic time cards. We'll look into it, Morrison said in a tone that suggested they absolutely would not look into it. The whole robbery had been brutal, but quick. According to the police report, the perpetrator had entered Chen's Liquor at 7:28 p.m., browsed for a few minutes, then approached the counter. When Mr. Chen opened the register to make change for a 20, the robber pulled a silver revolver, demanded all the cash, and when Chen hesitated, struck him across the temple with the gun butt. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. $3,200. That's what my freedom was worth. I want to talk to Mr. Chen, I said. Let me talk to him. He'll see I'm not the person who did this. Mr. Chen is very certain about his identification, Morrison replied. He said he'll never forget the face of the man who attacked him. But here's the thing about trauma. It doesn't make you a better witness. It makes you desperate to put a face to your fear, to have someone to blame. And apparently, my face was close enough. They kept me for 6 more hours, going over the same questions again and again. Where was I? Could anyone verify my alibi? Why did Mr. Chen pick me out of the lineup? Did I know Mr. Chen? Had I ever been to his store? The truth was, I'd never even been to that part of town. Chen's Liquor was a good 40-minute drive from both my house and my work. Why would I drive 40 minutes to rob a liquor store when there were plenty of places to rob closer to home? Not that I was thinking about robbing anyone, but the logic of it made no sense. Finally, they booked me. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole humiliating process. Bail was set at $50,000, which might as well have been $5 million. I used my one phone call to reach Patricia, Kayla's aunt, and asked her to take care of my daughter and find me a lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer, Patricia said, her voice shaking. Marcus, what happened? Kayla's beside herself. I didn't do this, Pat. I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't do this. Just, Just take care of Kayla. Tell her I love her, and that I'll figure this out. That night, sitting in a holding cell with actual criminals, I kept thinking about that blurry photo. Somewhere out there, the real robber was walking free with $3,000, while I sat in jail for his crime. I thought the truth would come out quickly. I thought the system would work. I had no idea how wrong I was. 3 days after my arrest, I met the man who would seal my fate through sheer incompetence. James Morrison walked into the attorney-client meeting room at the county jail looking like he'd slept in his suit because he probably had. His tie was askew. His shirt had coffee stains, and his eyes had that glassy, unfocused look of someone running on fumes and caffeine. Marcus Thompson, he asked, shuffling through a stack of files that looked ready to topple over. Armed robbery? Chen's Liquor. That's me. But I didn't? Yeah, he cut me off. Finally finding my file somewhere in the middle of his stack, they all say that. Look, I'm James Morrison, Public Defender's Office. I've been assigned to your case. Let's see what we're working with here. He opened my file and spent exactly 30 seconds skimming the arrest report before looking up at me with bloodshot eyes. The smell of stale coffee and cigarettes wafted across the table. Okay, so the victim ID'd you. You've got no alibi. I do have an alibi, I interrupted. I was at work. Henderson Distribution. I told the police to check the time cards, the security footage. My supervisor saw me there. Morrison made a note on a legal pad that was already covered in illegible scrawls. Right, we'll look into that. Listen, Thompson. I'm going to be straight with you. I've got 312 active cases right now. 312? You know how many hours there are in a day? I stared at him in disbelief. Are you saying you don't have time to defend me? I'm saying we need to be realistic. About our options, the prosecution's offering a plea deal. Plead guilty to robbery too. They'll drop the armed enhancement. You're looking at 5 to 7, instead of 15 to 20. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. Morrison sighed like I was a child refusing to eat vegetables. Look, Mr. Thompson, in my 15 years doing this job, everybody's innocent. But juries see a victim pointing at a defendant and saying that's the guy, and that's usually game over. Now, I can fight this if that's what you want, but I need you to understand the risks. 15 years. This man had been doing this for 15 years, and he couldn't even pretend to believe in his client's innocence for 15 minutes. What about the evidence? I asked. What about checking my alibi? What about finding witnesses who saw me at work? I'll file the necessary motions, he said, already closing my file. Discovery request, witness list, the usual. But Thompson, I need you to think seriously about that plea deal. 5 years versus 15, that's 10 years of your life we're talking about. How about 0 years for a crime I didn't commit? Morrison stood up, gathering his impossible stack of files. His hand shook slightly. Too much coffee or something stronger? I couldn't tell. I'll be in touch. Guards will take you back to your cell. The meeting had lasted exactly 15 minutes. 15 minutes to discuss the fight for my life. Over the next few weeks, I tried calling Morrison's office repeatedly. Each time, his secretary assured me he'd received my messages about the witnesses who could verify my alibi, about the time clock records, about the security system at Henderson that recorded everyone coming and going. Each time, she promised, he'd call me back. He never did. I wrote him letters listing every single person who saw me at work that day. Ray Jimenez, my supervisor. Maria Gonzalez from shipping. Tony Williams from receiving. Hell, even the vending machine guy had seen me when he came to Ristvaca around 7:15, right around the time someone was robbing Chen's Liquor across town. Morrison's response, when it finally came, was a brief note. Prosecution's case weaker than expected. Motion to dismiss. Filed. Don't worry. I was facing 20 years in prison for something I didn't do. My daughter was falling apart without me, and this man who'd spent 15 minutes with me was telling me not to worry. I tried to hire a private attorney, called every lawyer in the phone book, but they all wanted retainers. $10,000, $15,000, $25,000 for a felony trial. I had $8,000 saved for Kayla's college. Even if I gave them every penny, it wouldn't be enough. And what would happen to my daughter's future? So I was stuck with James Morrison, a man who saw me as just another file in a stack of 312 cases. Another guilty client proclaiming innocence. Another day at the office. I remember lying in my cell at night, listening to the sounds of the jail, metal doors clanging, inmates yelling, guards making their rounds, and thinking about more. Trembling hands and bloodshot eyes. This was the man holding my life in those shaky hands. This was my champion in the arena of justice. The Constitution guarantees everyone the right to an attorney. What it doesn't guarantee is an attorney who gives a damn. In those long weeks before trial, I became my own investigator from behind bars. Every phone call, every visit, every letter was dedicated to building the defense. Morrison wouldn't. Kayla came to see me twice a week, and I could see the toll this was taking on her. Her grades were slipping. She'd deferred her college enrollment, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. But she never gave up on me. Dad, I went to Henderson like you asked, she said during one visit, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Ray gave me these. Inside were copies of my time cards for the entire month, clearly showing I'd clocked in at 5:52 a.m. on March 14th, and hadn't clocked out until 8:47 p.m., 13 hours of documented work, with a 30-minute lunch break at noon that I'd taken in the break room because we were so busy with inventory. Ray says he remembers working with you that whole day. Kayla continued. He said you guys were in the back warehouse doing the quarterly inventory count until almost 9. He's willing to testify. My heart soared. This was it. Concrete proof I couldn't have been robbing anyone at 7:30 p.m. when I was scanning boxers 20 miles away. Did you give this to Morrison? I asked. Kayla's face fell. I tried. I went to his office 3 times. His secretary kept saying he was in court or with other clients. I finally left it with her, but we both knew how that would go. Into the stack of 312 cases, maybe to be looked at, maybe not. The security footage was even more frustrating. Henderson had a state-of-the-art system. Cameras at every entrance and exit, in the warehouse, even in the parking lot. The footage was kept for 90 days before being overwritten. We had time, but not much. I called Morrison's office again. The security footage at my work will show me there during the robbery. You need to subpoena it before they delete it. It's been almost a month already. I'll handle it, Morrison's secretary assured me. Mr. Morrison is aware of the situation. But days turned into weeks, and no subpoena was issued. I had Kayla call Henderson's security office. They confirmed they still had the footage but couldn't release it without a court order. Please, I begged Morrison during his next visit, only his second since our initial meeting. Just file the subpoena. It will prove I'm innocent. Morrison looked exhausted, more so than before. His suit was wrinkled, and I noticed his hands shaking worse than last time. The prosecution's case is circumstantial at best, he said, not really answering my question. Eyewitness ID is notoriously unreliable. I'll make sure the jury knows that, but the footage, I said I'll handle it, he snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. Sorry, it's been a long week. Look, I've been doing this a long time. Trust me, we don't need to chase down every little piece of evidence. Sometimes less is more in front of a jury. Less is more. My freedom was on the line, and this man was talking about minimalist defense strategies. My work friends were ready to testify. Maria Gonzalez remembered joking with me about the vending machine being out of Snickers bars around 7 p.m. Tony Williams had asked me to help him move some heavy boxers at 7:45. The vending machine guy, Jerome, had his own time-stamped receipts, showing he was at Henderson from 7:10 to 7:35 p.m. and remembered seeing me in the warehouse. I gave Morrison all their names, phone numbers, and written statements Kayla had collected. Each witness placed me at work during the exact time of the robbery. Any competent investigation would have cleared me in days. but there was no investigation. Morrison never called a single witness, never visited the warehouse, never looked at the route between Henderson Distribution and Chen's Liquor to show the impossibility of me being in both places. The prosecution, meanwhile, was building their narrative. Marcus Thompson, single father, struggling with money. Daughter, about to start college. Desperate times, calling for desperate measures. Never mind that I'd never been arrested before. Never mind that I had a steady job and savings. They had their story, and they were sticking to it. I learned later, years later, that the security footage from Henderson was deleted exactly 90 days after the robbery. The evidence that would have freed me. Erased forever, while Morrison juggled his 312 cases and assured me not to worry. But the worst part wasn't Morrison's incompetence. It was that nobody else seemed to care. The judge, the prosecution, and system itself. They all saw an overworked public defender and accepted it as normal. Just another day in the criminal justice machine, grinding up lives with the efficiency of a factory line. I kept thinking about that footage. Those digital files sitting on a server somewhere, holding the key to my freedom. Every day that passed was a day closer to their deletion. Every day Morrison didn't act was another nail in my coffin. 60 days. That's all he had to file a simple subpoena. 60 days to save an innocent man's life. He couldn't even do that. The morning of my trial, I put on the only suit I owned, the one Kayla had brought from home, the one I'd worn to her high school award ceremony just 6 months earlier. I looked at myself in the metal mirror of the holding cell and tried to see what the jury would see. A black man accused of armed robbery? Would they see Marcus Thompson, warehouse supervisor and devoted father? Or would they see exactly what they expected to see? The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. All those years of watching legal dramas on TV hadn't prepared me for the cramped reality of courtroom 4B in the county courthouse. Judge Patricia Hawkins presided, a stern woman in her 60s who looked like she'd seen it all and was tired of most of it. Morrison stumbled in 5 minutes late, his briefcase overflowing with papers from what were obviously other cases. He dropped into the chair beside me, bringing with him the now familiar smell of stale coffee and exhaustion. "How are you holding up?" he asked, not looking at me as he shuffled through papers. "Did you subpoena the security footage?" I whispered urgently. "We'll talk about strategy later," he said, which I'd learned was Morrison speak for no. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a sharp woman in her 30s who radiated competence and preparation, everything Morrison wasn't. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "the evidence will show that on the evening of March 14th, the defendant, Marcus Thompson, entered Chun's liquor store with one purpose, to commit armed robbery. He threatened Mr. Chen with a firearm. And when Mr. Chen hesitated, the defendant pistol-whipped him, leaving him with injuries that persist to this day." She painted a picture of me as a desperate man. Behind on bills, I wasn't. Facing financial pressure no more than anyone else, who decided to take a shortcut to easy money. She mentioned my daughter's college expenses repeatedly, turning my pride in Kayla's achievements into a motive for crime. "The defense may try to confuse you with talk of alibis and mistaken identity," Walsh continued, "but Mr. Chen will tell you himself. He will never forget the face of the man who attacked him. That face belongs to Marcus Thompson." When it was Morrison's turn, I held my breath. This was our moment to counter their narrative, to tell the jury about the time cards, the witnesses, the impossibility of me being in two places at once. Morrison stood slowly, papers sliding off the defense table onto the floor. He bent to pick them up, fumbled, dropped more. Someone in the jury box suppressed a laugh. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat, took a sip of water. "My client, Mr. Thompson, is innocent. The prosecution wants you to believe that, that he—" Morrison swayed slightly. I watched in growing horror as his eyes seemed to lose focus. He gripped the podium with both hands. "The evidence will show, the evidence." He trailed off, blinking rapidly as if trying to remember where he was. Judge Hawkins leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, do you need a moment?" "No, Your Honor, I apologize." He shuffled through his notes, clearly having lost his train of thought. "As I was saying, Mr. Thompson maintains his innocence. The prosecution's case relies entirely on the testimony of one witness who was traumatized and may be mistaken. Thank you." That was it, our entire opening statement. No mention of my alibi, no mention of witnesses who could place me at work, no passionate defense of an innocent man. Just a rambling, unfocused plea that sounded more like an apology than a defense. The prosecution began presenting their case with the testimony of Officer Daniel Martinez, the first responder to the scene. He described finding Mr. Chen bleeding from a head wound, the register empty, the store in disarray. Walsh introduced photographs of the scene, the injury, the empty register. Each image, another brick in the wall they were building around me. Morrison's cross-examination should have been straightforward. Point out that no physical evidence linked me to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon recovered. Instead, Morrison stood up, wobbled slightly, and asked exactly one question. "Officer Martinez, you didn't actually see my client at the scene. Did you? No. I responded after the robbery. No further questions. I wanted to scream. What about the lack of physical evidence? What about the sloppy investigation? What about the fact that they never even looked for anyone else after Mr. Chen picked me from the lineup? But Morrison was already sitting down, and I noticed his eyes starting to droop. It was 10:30 in the morning, and my lawyer was falling asleep. The next witness was Detective Morrison, still no relation to my attorney, who testified about my arrest and interrogation. He made it sound like I'd been evasive and uncooperative, when all I'd done was insist on my innocence and ask them to verify my alibi. When it came time for cross-examination, I nudged Morrison. He jerked awake, blinking in confusion. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Hawkins said sharply, "your witness." "Oh yes, sorry, Your Honor." He stood, swayed, and gripped the table. "Detective, did my client tell you where he was during the robbery?" he claimed. "He was at work." "And did you verify this claim?" Mr. Chen had already identified him. "We had our perpetrator." Morrison nodded as if this was a satisfactory answer and sat back down. I watched him struggle to keep his eyes open, his head starting to nod forward. This was my defense. This was my champion in the arena of justice. A man who couldn't even stay awake while my life hung in the balance. By lunch, I felt like I was drowning. The jury was buying the prosecution's story. I could see it in their faces. And why wouldn't they? They were being presented with a clear narrative by a competent prosecutor, while my attorney could barely form coherent sentences. During the lunch break, I confronted Morrison in the courthouse conference room. "You're falling asleep," I said. "In the middle of my trial? You're falling asleep." "I'm fine," he insisted, though his words were slightly slurred. "Just tired. Big case load. I told you, 312 cases. I don't care about your other cases. This is my life." But Morrison was already gathering his papers, mumbling about needing coffee as he left. I saw him pull a small pill bottle from his pocket and dry swallow 2 pills. That afternoon would only get worse. The afternoon session began with the prosecution's star witness, Mr. Chen himself. The elderly store owner walked slowly to the witness stand, a visible scar on his temple where he'd been struck. The jury's sympathy was palpable. Here was the victim, still bearing the marks of violence. Facing his attacker, Walsh guided Chen through his testimony with practiced ease. He described the evening of March 14th, how the robber had entered his store, pretended to shop, then approached the counter. "I opened register to make change," Chen said in accented but clear English. "Then he pulled gun, silver gun, pointed at my face." "What happened next?" Walsh prompted. "I was scared, my hands shaking. He yelled at me to hurry. When I didn't move fast enough, he hit me." Chen touched his temple. Everything went dark for a moment. When I could see again, he was taking money from register. "Mr. Chen, do you see the man who robbed you in this courtroom?" Chen's finger pointed directly at me. "Yes. Him, the defendant? I will never forget his face." The jury turned to look at me. I wanted to stand up and scream that he was wrong, that trauma had twisted his memory, that I'd never set foot in his store. But all I could do was sit there while Morrison's head began to droop beside me. "Your witness, Mr. Morrison," Judge Hawkins said. Morrison didn't move. His chin had dropped to his chest and his breathing had deepened. He was asleep. Completely, utterly asleep. "Mr. Morrison." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. He jerked awake, papers scattering. "Yes, present. Your Honor." Snickers rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hawkins's face darkened. Counsel approached. I watched Morrison stumble toward the bench, where the judge proceeded to give him a hushed but clearly furious lecture. When he returned, his face was flushed, but his eyes were still struggling to focus. "Mr. Chen," Morrison began, consulting notes he clearly hadn't reviewed. "You were traumatized during this event, correct?" "Yes, very scared. And trauma can affect memory, can't it?" Walsh objected before Chen could answer. "Counsel is asking the witness to speculate about psychology." Sustained. Morrison blinked, lost again. "Let me rephrase. Mr. Chen, the lighting in your store, is it very bright? Normal lighting? And the robber wore a hood, dark jacket." "Yes." So his face was partially obscured. I saw his face when he came to counter. Saw it clearly. Morrison nodded and actually started to sit down, then seemed to remember he should ask more questions. But as he stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes began to close again. "Mr. Morrison," the judge prompted. "No further questions." He mumbled and collapsed into his chair. I watched the jury's faces. Whatever doubt Morrison might have created about the reliability of eyewitness identification had been completely overshadowed by the spectacle of my attorney. Falling asleep during They weren't thinking about reasonable doubt anymore. They were wondering what kind of person has a lawyer who can't even stay awake. The prosecution continued with testimony from the paramedic who treated Chen, establishing the severity of his injuries. Morrison's eyes were closed through most of it. When it came time to cross-examine, I had to physically shake his shoulder. "No questions," he said without even lifting his head. By 3 p.m., Morrison was sleeping openly. His head lolled back in his chair, and at one point, a soft snore escaped. The court reporter looked at the judge uncertainly. 2 jurors were whispering to each other, shooting incredulous looks at the defense table. Judge Hawkins called another sidebar. This time, her voice carried despite her efforts to keep it low. Mr. Morrison, this is absolutely unacceptable. If you cannot remain alert, I'll have to consider declaring a mistrial for ineffective assistance of counsel. The word mistrial seemed to penetrate Morrison's fog. No, Your Honor, I'm fine. Just a moment of ... I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. As the prosecution presented evidence about my financial situation, making my modest savings sound like desperate poverty, Morrison's chin drooped again. When they introduced the time-stamped receipt from the robbery, showing $3,200 stolen, Morrison was fully asleep. I wrote, "Wake up" on my legal pad and slid it in front of him. Nothing. I kicked his shin under the table. He stirred but didn't wake. Finally, I grabbed his shoulder and shook hard. He came to with a start, knocking over his water glass. The contents spread across the defense table, soaking into his scattered papers. The jury watched in dismay as we scrambled to clean up the mess. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," Judge Hawkins suggested, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion at all. During the break, I confronted Morrison in the hallway. "What are you on?" I demanded. "Pills, booze." "What? Nothing. I told you, I'm just tired, overworked. You're destroying my life. I need you awake. I need you to fight for me." Morrison's eyes flashed with something. Anger? Shame? Maybe both. "You think I want to be like this? You think I chose to have 312 cases? You know what I make $48,000 a year? You know what a first-year associate at a corporate firm makes? $160. But I'm here, aren't I? I'm doing my best. Your best is going to send me to prison for 20 years. Then take the plea deal," he snapped. 5 to 7. "You'll be out in time to see your daughter graduate college." I stared at him in disbelief. "I'm innocent." "Yay," Morrison said, his anger deflating into exhaustion. "They all are." When we returned to the courtroom, Morrison made an effort to stay alert. He kept his eyes open through the rest of the prosecution's case, though I could see him fighting sleep every minute. His cross-examinations remained perfunctory and ineffective, but at least he was conscious. The damage was done. Though the jury had seen my lawyer sleeping through crucial testimony, they'd watched him stumble and slur and knock over water glasses. Whatever presumption of innocence I'd walked in with had been replaced by a different presumption. If your own lawyer doesn't care enough to stay awake, you must be guilty. That night, back in my cell, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Morrison's nodding head, the jury's disgusted faces, Mr. Chun's pointing finger. I thought about Kayla, about the college savings that would go unspent, about the life that was slipping away because the Constitution's promise of legal representation had been fulfilled by a man who couldn't fulfill the basic requirement of consciousness. Somewhere in the city, the real robber was probably spending that $3,200, completely unaware that someone else was taking the fall for his crime. Or maybe he was aware. Maybe he was following the trial in the news, amazed at his good fortune. Either way, he was free, and I was watching my freedom disappear, one snore at a time. The prosecution's case was like watching a masterclass in legal storytelling. Jennifer Walsh knew exactly what she was doing, building her narrative brick by brick while my defense crumbled beside me. On day 3 of the trial, she introduced the financial evidence. Bank statements, bills, credit card records, all perfectly legal to obtain, all painting a picture of a man under pressure. Mr. Thompson had $8,000 in savings, Walsh told the jury, as if this was somehow suspicious rather than responsible. His daughter's college tuition would require at least $20,000 for the first year alone. Where was that money going to come from? She made my regular life sound desperate. The car payment I'd never missed became evidence of financial strain. The fact that I'd comparison shopped for Kayla's laptop showed obsessive concern about money. Even my overtime hours at Henderson, the very hours that proved my innocence, were twisted into evidence of a man desperately trying to make ends meet. Morrison objected occasionally, but his heart wasn't in it. Relevance, he'd mumble, and Judge Hawkins would usually overrule him. He never explained why the objection mattered, never fought for it, never made the prosecution work for their evidence. The worst part was watching Walsh work around the gaps in her case. She had no physical evidence, so she emphasized the violence of the crime. She had no weapon, so she focused on Mr. Chen's terror. She had no connection between me and the store, so she talked about how criminals often travel far from home to avoid recognition. The defendant was smart, she told the jury. He didn't rob a store in his own neighborhood. He drove across town, thinking distance would protect him. But Mr. Chun's memory is stronger than the defendant anticipated. Every weakness became a strength in her hands. The lack of fingerprints, I must have worn gloves. No DNA. I was careful not to touch anything except the money. No recovery of the stolen cash. I must have spent it quickly, or hidden it well. Morrison should have been destroying these arguments. He should have been pointing out that speculation isn't evidence, that the prosecution was asking the jury to fill in blanks with their imagination. Instead, he sat there, occasionally jotting notes he'd never refer to, fighting to keep his eyes open. The prosecution brought in a financial expert who testified about the economic pressure points in my life. This guy had never met me, never studied my actual finances beyond the superficial records. But he spoke with authority about my likely mental state given my financial profile. Objection, Morrison said weakly. Speculation. Your grounds, Judge Hawkins asked. Morrison blinked, clearly having forgotten why he objected. Withdrawn. I wrote furiously on my legal pad. He can't testify about my mental state. Expert witnesses need foundation. Morrison glanced at my notes, nodded vaguely, but said nothing more. The parade of prosecution witnesses continued. The emergency room doctor who treated Mr. Chen described his injuries in vivid detail. The crime scene technician talked about the chaos in the store, the blood on the floor, the emptied register. Each witness added emotional weight to the prosecution's case, making the jury forget that none of them had actually seen me commit any crime. Where were my witnesses? Where was Ray Jimenez, my supervisor, ready to testify that I was with him during the robbery? Where was Maria Gonzalez or Tony Williams or Jerome the vending machine guy? They were sitting at home or at work, waiting for subpoenas that Morrison never sent. The defense has the right to present witnesses, Judge Hawkins reminded Morrison at one point, clearly growing frustrated with his passivity. Yes, Your Honor, we're evaluating our options. Evaluating our options. We were 3 days into trial, and he was still evaluating. The final prosecution witness was their crown jewel, a jailhouse informant named Rakai Valdez who claimed I'd confessed to him while we were both in county lockup. He told me he needed the money for his daughter, Valdez testified. Looking earnest in his orange jumpsuit, said the old man at the liquor store had it coming. This was complete fabrication. I'd never spoken to Valdez beyond asking him to pass the salt at dinner. But he was facing his 3rd strike on a drug charge, and testifying against me was his ticket to a reduced sentence. Morrison's cross-examination should have been brutal. Valdez had a record as long as my arm, a history of lying to police, and an obvious motive to fabricate testimony. Instead, Morrison asked a few perfunctory questions about Valdez's criminal history and sat down. Mr. Morrison, I whispered urgently, ask him about his deal with the prosecution. Ask him what they promised him. Morrison waved me off like I was an annoying fly. I covered his credibility issues. He'd done nothing of the sort. The jury had heard Valdez's lies, and Morrison's weak cross-examination had done nothing to expose them. As the prosecution rested their case, I felt the walls closing in. They'd presented a compelling narrative. Desperate father, violent robbery, traumatized victim who identified me, and now even a confession. It was all built on lies and speculation, but it was professionally presented by a competent prosecutor. To a jury that had watched my own lawyer sleep through testimony, the prosecution rests. Your Honor, Walsh announced, confident and composed. Judge Hawkins turned to our table. Mr. Morrison, will the defense be presenting witnesses? Morrison stood unsteadily. Your Honor, we'd like to request a brief recess to discuss our strategy. I could see the judge's patience wearing thin. Very well, we'll reassess until tomorrow morning. Mr. Morrison, I trust you'll be prepared to proceed with your case in chief at that time. As the jury filed out, I grabbed Morrison's arm. We need to talk, now. In the conference room, I laid out everything, one more time. The witnesses who could place me at work, the time cards Kayla had obtained, the security footage that had existed, but was now gone because he'd never subpoenaed it. It's too late for the footage, Morrison said, but I can call some witnesses if I really think. I slammed my hand on the table. My supervisor will testify I was with him. How is that even a question? Morrison rubbed his eyes. Fine, give me the names again. I'll have my secretary call them tonight. Tonight? The trial's almost over. Better late than never, he said, gathering his papers. I watched him shuffle out, knowing in my gut that no calls would be made. Morrison's secretary probably left at 5 p.m. sharp, and Morrison himself would likely be passed out by 7. That night, I called Kayla from jail. Baby, I need you to do something, I said. Call Ray Jimenez, call Maria and Tony. Tell them to be at the courthouse tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Tell them it's my only chance. Dad, what about subpoenas? Can they just show up? They have to. Morris, not going to do it. This is all we have left. I could hear her crying on the other end. This isn't fair. You didn't do anything wrong. I know, baby. I know. Just make those calls. Okay. And no matter what happens, remember that I love you. The next morning would determine my fate. The sleeping defense was about to present its case, and I had no faith left that justice would prevail. The morning of the defense case, I sat at the defendant's table with a glimmer of hope. In the gallery behind me, I could see Ray Jimenez, my supervisor, dressed in his best shirt and tie. Maria Gonzalez was there too, nervously clutching her purse. Tony Williams had taken the day off work. Even Jerome, the vending machine guy, had shown up with his route records from March 14th. Kayla had done it. She'd gotten them all there. My witnesses, ready to tell the truth, ready to save me. Morrison stumbled in 10 minutes late, reeking of alcohol masked by too much cologne. His suit was the same one he'd worn all week, getting progressively more wrinkled. He dropped his briefcase, spilling papers across the floor, and didn't even notice my witnesses in the gallery. Your Honor, Morrison began, swaying slightly as he stood. The defense calls, ... He shuffled through his papers, clearly having no idea who to call. He hadn't prepared anything, Mr. Morrison, Judge Hawkins prompted, her patience exhausted. I scribbled frantically on my pad. Ray Jimenez, my supervisor. Morrison glanced at my note, squinted. The defense calls Ray ... Jimenez. Jimenez? Ray corrected as he approached the witness stand. At least Morrison had gotten that far. Mr. Jimenez? Jimenez, Ray corrected again. Right. Were you working on March 14th? Yes. And did you see my client that day? Yes. Marcus and I worked together all day doing quarterly inventory. This was it. This was the testimony that would save me. But Morrison just stood there, blinking at Ray like he'd never seen him before. What time did you work with him? I whispered urgently. Morrison repeated my question verbatim. What time did you work with him? Marcus clocked in at 5:52 a.m. I know because he beat me there, and he always gave me grief about being late. We worked together straight through until almost 9 p.m. We were doing the quarterly inventory in the back warehouse. And what time was the robbery? I whispered. Morrison looked confused. And ... What time was the robbery? Objection, Walsh said. The witness wouldn't know when the robbery occurred. Sustained. Morrison stood there, lost. He hadn't thought to ask Ray specifically about 7:30 p.m. Hadn't prepared any questions to establish the impossibility of me being in two places at once. Was Marcus with you at 7:30 p.m.? I wrote desperately. Was Marcus with you at 7:30 p.m.? Morrison parroted absolutely. We were in the middle of counting stock in aisle 17. I remember because that's when Jerome came by with the vending machine delivery, and Marcus joked about the Snickers bars being gone again. Finally, some real testimony. But Morrison didn't follow up. He didn't ask for more details, didn't have Ray explain the layout of the warehouse, didn't establish how far it was from Chin's Liquor. He just stood there, swaying slightly. No further questions, he mumbled. What? I hissed. Ask him about the time cards, ask him about the security system. But Morrison was already shuffling back to the defense table. Walsh stood for cross-examination, sharp as ever. Mr. Jimenez, you're Mr. Thompson's friend, aren't you? We work together. I'd say we're friendly. And you'd lie for a friend, wouldn't you? Objection? I shouted, forgetting I wasn't allowed to speak. Mr. Thompson? Judge Hawkins snapped. You will remain silent or be removed from the courtroom. Mr. Morrison, control your client. Morrison hadn't even objected to the question. He mumbled an apology while Walsh continued destroying Ray's credibility, painting him as a biased witness who'd say anything to help a coworker. The rest of my witnesses fared no better. Morrison called Maria Gonzalez, but forgot to ask her about seeing me at 7 p.m. He called Tony Williams, but never established the timeline of when Tony had asked for my help moving boxes. Jerome testified about his vending machine route, but Morrison failed to connect it to my presence in the warehouse. Each witness had crucial testimony that could have saved me, but Morrison extracted none of it. He asked rambling, unfocused questions, forgot key points, and sometimes just stood there in silence until Judge Hawkins prompted him to continue. The worst moment came when Morrison attempted to introduce the time cards Kayla had obtained. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce ... These? He held up the copies uncertainly. What are they? Judge Hawkins asked. Time cards, I think, from the defendant's work. Who obtained these? How were they authenticated? Where's your foundation? Morrison blinked. Foundation. Did you subpoena these records? Do you have a custodian of records to authenticate them? I know. The defendant's daughter got them. Then they're inadmissible hearsay. Objection sustained. Walsh hadn't even needed to object. The judge did it for her. The time cards that proved my innocence were excluded because Morrison didn't know basic evidence law that any first-year law student could have handled. By noon, Morrison had burned through all my witnesses without establishing a coherent alibi. He'd turned my salvation into a disaster, making my witnesses look unprepared and unreliable. Does the defense have any additional witnesses? Judge Hawkins asked. Morrison stood, wobbled, and gripped the table. The defense rests. What about me? I said urgently. I want to testify. Morrison shook his head. Bad idea. They'll bring up your arrest, make you look bad. I don't have an arrest record. You do now, because of this case. Morrison, please, let me tell my story. But he was already sitting down, and I could see his eyelids growing heavy again. My last chance to speak for myself, denied by a lawyer who thought his inadequate performance was somehow better than letting me tell the truth. The defense case had lasted less than 3 hours. 3 hours to counter days of prosecution testimony. 3 hours of fumbled questions, missed opportunities, and excluded evidence. In the gallery, I saw Ray and the others looking confused and frustrated. They'd come to help, taken time off work, prepared to tell the truth, and Morrison had wasted their testimony. Kayla was crying silently, realizing that all her efforts to save me had been for nothing. The truth had been right there in that courtroom, in the witnesses, in the excluded time cards, in my own silenced voice. But Morrison had managed to keep all of it from the jury, not through malice but through sheer devastating incompetence. The sleeping defense had presented its case, and it was exactly the disaster I had feared it would be. Closing arguments were the final nail in my coffin. Walsh went first, weaving together her narrative with the skill of a master storyteller. She reminded the jury of Mr. Chen's testimony, his pointing finger, his absolute certainty. She dismissed my witnesses as biased coworkers who'd say anything to help a friend. She painted me as a desperate father who'd made a terrible choice and was now trying to lie his way out of consequences. The defendant wants you to believe he was in 2 places at once, she said, but we all know that's impossible. What's more likely that Mr. Chen, the victim of this violent crime, is mistaken about the face of his attacker, or that the defendant's friends are lying to protect him. When Morrison stood for our closing, I held my breath. This was his last chance to save me, to point out the gaping holes in the prosecution's case, to remind the jury about reasonable doubt. He shuffled to the podium, no notes in hand, and stood there for a long moment in silence. Ladies and gentlemen, he finally began, his voice hoarse. My client says he's innocent. His coworkers say he was at work. That's reasonable doubt. He stood there for another moment, as if trying to remember what else he wanted to say. Then, he shrugged, actually shrugged, and returned to his seat. That was it. That was my closing argument. 43 seconds of mumbling that sounded more like surrender than defense. Judge Hawkins gave the jury their instructions, explaining the law about burden of proof and reasonable doubt, but I could see in their faces that they'd already made up their minds. Who could blame them? They'd watched the prosecution present a professional case while my attorney slept, stumbled, and shrugged his way through trial. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours to decide the rest of my life. Kayla sat in the gallery, holding Patricia's hand, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday because she'd spent the night at the courthouse, afraid to leave in case the verdict came in. Bailiff announced the jury was returning. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break through my chest. This was it. This was the moment when I'd either walk free to rebuild my life or disappear into the prison system for decades. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hawkins asked. The foreman stood, a middle-aged white man in a polo shirt who'd spent the trial taking careful notes. We have, Your Honor. What say you? He unfolded the paper with steady hands. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Thompson, guilty of robbery in the 1st degree. The word hit me like a physical blow. Guilty, guilty. The room started spinning. We further find the defendant guilty of assault in the 2nd degree. Behind me, Kayla let out a wail that tore through my chest. I turned to see her collapse against Patricia, sobbing uncontrollably. My baby girl, watching her father branded a violent criminal for something he didn't do. Morrison put a hand on my shoulder. We'll appeal, he mumbled, the same empty promise he'd made from the beginning. Judge Hawkins thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for 2 weeks later. As the bailiffs approached with shackles, I had one last moment to look at Kayla. I love you, I mouthed. This isn't over. But it felt over. It felt like everything was over. They led me out of the courtroom in chains, past Ray and Maria, and Tony, who looked stunned and helpless, past the real robber, wherever he was, still free with his $3,200, past any hope of justice in a system where your defense attorney could sleep through your trial, and nobody seemed to think that was a problem worth fixing. In the holding cell, waiting for transport back to county jail, I replayed every moment of the trial. Every time Morrison's head had drooped, every question he'd failed to ask, every objection he'd missed. The security footage that could have saved me, deleted because he couldn't file a simple subpoena. The time cards excluded because he didn't. No basic evidence rules. 2 weeks later, at sentencing, Walsh asked for the maximum 20 years. She talked about the need to protect elderly store owners, about the message we send when we tolerate violent crime, about my lack of remorse for a crime I didn't commit. Morrison asked for leniency, citing my clean record and family responsibilities. But his heart wasn't in it. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, probably managing his other 311 cases. Judge Hawkins sentenced me to 15 years in state prison. 15 years. I was 42 years old. By the time I got out, if I lived that long, I'd be pushing 60. Kayla would be in her 30s. I'd miss her college graduation, her wedding, maybe the birth of grandchildren, all because a sleepy public defender couldn't stay awake long enough to defend an innocent man. As they led me away to begin my sentence, Morrison called out, "Don't worry, Marcus, we'll file that appeal, you'll see." But I knew better. The appeal would be as half-hearted as the trial. Morrison would file some boilerplate brief between naps, and it would be denied. Because that's how the system works for people like me. People who can't afford real lawyers. People whose lives depend on the conscientiousness of overworked, underpaid, burnt-out public defenders. The transport van pulled away from the courthouse, heading for state prison. Through the barred window, I watched the world I'd known disappear. Somewhere in that world, Mr. Chen was running his store, still believing he'd identified the right man. The real robber was spending his stolen money, and Morrison was probably already asleep at his desk, my file buried somewhere in his stack of 312 cases. Justice wasn't blind. She was asleep at the defense table. State prison was nothing like county jail. County was temporary, filled with people waiting for trial or serving short sentences. State was permanent, home to men who'd given up on ever seeing the outside again. The moment I stepped off the transport bus at Morgantown Correctional Facility, I knew I'd entered a different world. Fresh meat coming through. A guard yelled as we shuffled in chains through the intake area. The veterans watched us with predatory eyes, sizing up the new arrivals, looking for weakness or opportunity. Processing took hours. Strip search, delousing shower, medical exam, psychological evaluation. They took my name and gave me a number. 38,429. That's who I was now. Not Marcus Thompson, warehouse supervisor and father. Just 38,429, convicted armed robber. My cell was on deep A block, a 6x8 concrete box with a metal toilet, a sink, and a bunk bed. My cellmate was Carlos Mendez, doing 25 to life for murder. He looked me up and down when I entered. What you in for? Armed robbery? But I didn't save it. He cut me off. Nobody in here did nothing. First rule, don't talk about your case unless someone asks. Second rule, mind your own business. Third rule, respect is everything. You lose it, you lose everything. That first night, I lay on the thin mattress listening to the sounds of prison metal doors slamming, men yelling, someone crying in a nearby cell. I thought about Kayla, wondered if she was lying awake too, missing her father. 15 years of nights like this stretched ahead of me. The next morning brought the harsh reality of prison routine. Wake up at 5 a.m., count at 5:30, breakfast at 6 powdered eggs, stale toast, weak coffee, then work assignments. As a new arrival with no prison job experience, I got kitchen duty, washing dishes for 8 hours a day at 19 cents an hour. Thompson. The kitchen supervisor barked on my first day. You know how to keep your head down and work. Yes. Sir, good. Do that for a few years. Maybe you'll get promoted to cooking a few years. Like that was nothing. Like years of my life were just currency to be spent on slightly better prison jobs. The worst part was the visits. Kayla came every weekend at first, driving 3 hours each way. Seeing her through the plexiglass barrier, talking through a scratchy phone, was torture. She was 19 now, should have been in college, but she'd deferred enrollment to work and help Patricia with bills. I'm looking into lawyers, she told me during one visit. For the appeal, there's got to be someone who can help. Baby, lawyers cost money we don't have. I'll figure it out. I'm not giving up on you, Dad, but I could see the toll it was taking. Dark circles under her eyes. Weight loss. The brightness dimming in her smile. My conviction wasn't just stealing my life, it was stealing hers too. The other inmates had their own stories of injustice. My bunkie Carlos claimed he'd shot a man in self-defense, but couldn't afford a good lawyer. Down the hall, Jerome was doing life for a robbery where nobody could place him at the scene, except one witness who'd recanted. Years later, too late to matter. In the yard I met Douglas, 15 years into a 30-year sentence for drugs, still maintaining the cops. Planted the evidence. You're really innocent, Douglas asked me one day in the yard. Yeah, I was at work when the robbery happened. Had witnesses, and everything. He nodded knowingly. Let me guess, public defender? How'd you know? Same story, different verse. Mine showed up drunk to trial. Yours kept falling asleep. Douglas laughed bitterly. They ought to charge them, boys with malpractice. But who's gonna prosecute? The same system that employs them. I started learning the unwritten rules of prison life. Which tables in the mess hall belonged to which groups. When to look away, and when to stand your ground. How to do time without letting time do you. But the hardest lesson was accepting that nobody on the outside really cared about my innocence. The lawyers Kayla called wanted massive retainers, just to review the case. The innocence organizations were overwhelmed, only taking cases with DNA evidence. The media had no interest in another story about a possibly innocent black man in prison. That wasn't news. That was Tuesday. Morrison had filed my appeal, as promised. I got a copy of the brief, all 12 pages of it. 12 pages to overturn, a conviction that had taken 3 days to secure. He'd raised 2 issues, ineffective assistance of counsel ironic, coming from him, and insufficient evidence. Both were denied without a hearing. The appellate court's decision was 2 paragraphs long. 2 paragraphs to seal my fate. 3 months into my sentence, I got a job in the library. The pay was the same 19 cents an hour, but the environment was better, quiet, books, and most importantly, a law section. That's where I met Carl Washington, the jailhouse lawyer who would change my life. Carl was 63, been down for 22 years on a conspiracy charge. He'd taught himself law from prison libraries and had successfully challenged his own sentence twice, knocking 15 years off his original time. Q. Thompson, he asked one day, peering at me over wire-rimmed glasses held together with tape. Heard you claim actual innocence? I don't claim it. I am innocent. Carl studied me for a long moment. You know, most guys in here say that. But you, you got that look. The look of a man who can't believe this is real. Like you're still waiting to wake up from a nightmare. It feels like a nightmare. Yeah, well, nightmares end when you open your eyes. This ends when you learn the law. You interested in learning? That's how my real education began. Not in college classrooms like I'd planned for Kayla, but in a prison library. Learning from a man who'd spent 2 decades fighting the system from inside its belly. Carl started me on the basics: criminal procedure, constitutional law, how to read cases and spot issues, how to write motions that judges might actually read instead of immediately denying. Your trial lawyer fell asleep, Carl asked when I told him the story, multiple times, and the judge didn't declare a mistrial. She threatened to, but Morrison woke up enough to keep going. Carl shook his head. That's your issue right there. Strickland v. Washington says you're entitled to effective assistance of counsel. Sleeping through crucial testimony ain't effective. You file the right motion, with the right evidence, you might get a hearing. Hope. For the first time in months, I felt hope. But hope in prison is dangerous. It makes the days longer, the walls higher. It makes you believe things might change when everyone around you knows better. Still, I grabbed onto it with both hands. What else did I have? I wrote to Kayla that night, telling her about Carl and the law library and the possibility of challenging my conviction properly. Her response came 2 weeks later, tear-stained but determined. Dad, I'm not giving up. I'm saving every penny. I'll hire a real lawyer. I'll get the security footage. Somehow, I'll find the real robber. You just hang on. We're going to beat this. Love, Kayla, my baby girl, fighting for me from the outside while I learned to fight from within. Together, maybe we had a chance. Or maybe hope was just another kind of prison, one with invisible bars, but just as confining as the real ones. Only time would tell, and time was all I had. The law library became my second home. Every moment not spent working in the kitchen or at mandatory counts. I was there, surrounded by legal volumes that held the secrets to my freedom. Carl Washington was a harsh teacher, but that's what I needed. You can't just say your lawyer was ineffective, Carl explained, pushing a stack of cases across the table. You got to prove it. 2 prongs: deficient performance and prejudice. Show the lawyer screwed up, then show it made a difference. I read Strickland v. Washington until I could recite it from memory. Then I read every case that cited it, building a map of how courts interpreted ineffective assistance. Most claims failed. The bar was high. Lawyers could be drunk, unprepared, even hostile to their clients, and still not meet the standard for ineffective assistance. But sleeping through trial, that was different. Look here, Carl said, pointing to a case from the Ninth Circuit. Javer v. United States. Lawyer slept during closing arguments. New trial ordered. And here, Berdine v. Johnson. Lawyer slept during guilt phase of capital trial. Conviction reversed. So I have precedent. You have arguments. Now you need evidence. That was the hard part. I needed affidavits from people who'd seen Morrison sleeping. The court reporter's transcript showed several instances where Judge Hawkins had to prompt Morrison to respond, but it didn't explicitly say he was asleep. I needed witnesses. I wrote to everyone I could think of. Jurors weren't allowed to be contacted. But what about the bailiff, the court reporter, other lawyers who'd been in the courtroom? Most letters went unanswered. The few responses I got were discouraging. Nobody wanted to get involved. Nobody wanted to speak ill of a fellow officer of the court. But I kept studying. Criminal procedure, evidence law, constitutional rights. I learned about Brady violations when prosecutors withhold exculpatory evidence. I studied ineffective assistance claims that had succeeded. I read about actual innocence and the impossibly high standards for proving it. You're getting good at this, Carl observed one day, watching me draft a motion. Better than some lawyers. I've known fat lot of good it does me in here. Knowledge is power, young brother, even in prison, especially in prison. He was right. Other inmates started coming to me for help with their cases. Simple stuff at first: how to file a motion, what form to use, how to cite cases properly. I couldn't give legal advice, but I could show them what I'd learned. The library job came with one major perk: access to legal databases during certain hours. Most inmates used the time to research their own cases, but I had bigger plans. I started researching Morrison himself. What I found made my blood boil. James Morrison had been disciplined by the Bar Association 3 times in the past 5 years. Complaints ranged from missing filing deadlines to appearing intoxicated in court. He'd been suspended once for 6 months after falling asleep during a different trial, 2 years before mine. This is it, I told Carl, printing out the records. He had a history of sleeping through trials. Carl adjusted his taped glasses, reading carefully. This is good. Shows a pattern. But you still need someone who saw him sleeping during your trial specifically. I kept digging and found a local news article about my trial with a courtroom sketch. In the background, barely visible, was Morrison at the defense table, his head tilted back, eyes clearly closed. The sketch artist had captured him sleeping. Now we're getting somewhere, Carl said. I tracked down the sketch artist, Emma Rodriguez, wrote her a letter explaining my situation, begging for her help. 2 weeks later, I got a response. Mr. Thompson, I remember your trial. I sketched it for the Daily Tribune. Yes, I observed your attorney appearing to sleep on multiple occasions. I would be willing to provide an affidavit to this effect. I nearly cried reading those words. Finally, someone willing to speak the truth. The prison law library had templates for post-conviction motions, but Carl taught me to write my own. Judges see these cookie-cutter filings all day, he said. You want to stand out? Tell your story. Make them care. I spent months crafting my motion. Every word mattered. I detailed Morrison's sleeping, supported by the sketch artist's affidavit and the disciplinary records. I explained how his failure to subpoena the security footage prejudiced my case. I listed the witnesses he'd failed to properly question, the evidence he'd failed to introduce. But I also told my story. About Kayla waiting for a father who wouldn't come home. About the warehouse job I'd lost, the life destroyed by incompetent representation. I wrote about the real killer walking free while I served his time. It's good, Carl said after reading the final draft. Real good, but you know the odds, right? Pro se motions, inmates representing themselves, they almost never succeed. No, but what else can I do? You could get a lawyer. Kayla had been trying. She'd saved almost $3,000 working 2 jobs. But every lawyer she called wanted 10 times that, just to review the case. The legal aid organizations were swamped. The innocence projects focused on DNA cases. We were stuck in a system where you needed money to prove you shouldn't be in prison, but being in prison meant you had no money. I filed the motion myself. 47 pages, meticulously researched and argued. I sent copies to Kayla, to a few journalists who'd covered my trial, to anyone who might care. Then I waited. The law library became my refuge and my obsession. I read every ineffective assistance case I could find, memorizing facts, holdings, I learned about the sleeping lawyer syndrome in capital cases, where multiple defendants had been executed after trials where their lawyers slept. At least you're not on death row, another inmate said, trying to be helpful. 15 years might as well be death, I replied. It's death in slow motion. I helped other inmates with their cases to pass time and build karma, taught them to read cases, spot issues, write clearly. Some called me Law Professor Thompson, half mocking, half respectful. One day, a new inmate arrived in the library. Tommy Chen, no relation to the store owner. He was doing 5 years for identity theft, claimed innocence like everyone else. But something he said caught my attention. My cellmate at county was this guy named Julio Marcos. Tommy mentioned casually. Dude was always bragging about jobs he'd pulled and never got caught for. Said he once robbed a liquor store, pistol whipped the owner, made off with $3 grand. Cops grabbed the wrong guy for it. My heart stopped. When was this? I don't know. Couple years ago. He said it was some Chinese place on the south side. Chen's Liquor. Tommy shrugged. Maybe. Sounds right. Why? That's my case. I'm doing 15 years for that robbery. Tommy's eyes widened. No shit, man. Julio thought it was hilarious. Said the old man picked some other black dude out of a lineup. Swore it was him. Julio's Mexican, but he said trauma makes people see what they expect to see. Is Julio still in county? Nah. He made bail on the identity beef and skipped probably in Mexico by now. My hands shook as I wrote down everything Tommy told me. Finally, a lead on the real robber. But a lead wasn't proof, and hearsay from a fellow inmate wouldn't get me far in court. Still, I added it to my files. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every thread could be the one that unraveled my conviction. 6 months after filing my motion, I got a response. The court had denied it without a hearing. The judge wrote that sleeping lawyers, while unfortunate, didn't automatically constitute ineffective assistance. I'd failed to show how the outcome would have been different with an awake attorney. That's bullshit, I told Carl, slamming the denial on the table. How can I show a different outcome when they won't even give me a hearing? Welcome to the criminal justice system, Carl said calmly. Now you file again. Better hobbyists this time. New arguments, new angles. You don't stop until they listen, or your time runs out. So I went back to work, researching federal habeas corpus, learning about AEDPA deadlines, studying exhaustion requirements. The law was a maze designed to trap the uninformed, but I was becoming an expert navigator. Kayla visited monthly now, the weekly trips too expensive with gas prices rising. She looked older, worn down by working and fighting for me. I met with another lawyer, she said during one visit. He said your case has merit, but he wants $25,000 to take it on. Baby, don't kill yourself trying to raise that money. I'm learning the law. I'm going to get myself out. She smiled sadly. My dad, the jailhouse lawyer. I'm proud of you. But pride didn't unlock cells. Knowledge didn't automatically equal freedom. I was becoming an expert in the law while serving time for a crime I didn't commit, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Still, I kept studying, kept writing, kept fighting, because what else was there to do? Give up and serve 15 years quietly? Except that Morrison's incompetence had sealed my fate. No, I'd become my own lawyer because the one the state gave me had failed so spectacularly, and maybe, just maybe, I'd learned enough to succeed where he'd failed. The law library closed at 9 p.m., but I'd lie awake in my cell, running through cases and arguments. Somewhere out there, Julio Marcos was free, laughing about the man serving time for his crime. Morrison was probably still practicing, still sleeping through trials, still destroying lives through negligence. But I had something they didn't expect: time, determination, and a growing understanding of the system that had trapped me. I'd become my own lawyer, not by choice, but by necessity, and I was just getting started. Running an investigation from prison is like trying to perform surgery with your hands tied behind your back. Every phone call is monitored and limited to 15 minutes. Every letter is read by guards. Internet access is non-existent. But I had something more powerful than freedom, desperation, and time. I started with Tommy Chen's information about Julio Marcos. I couldn't search for him online, couldn't run a background check, couldn't do any of the things a real investigator would do, but I could write letters. I wrote to every Marcos in the phone book for the tri-state area. I'm looking for information about Julio Marcos, approximately 30 to 35 years old, who may have been in county jail in March 2016. Most letters came back undelivered or unanswered, but persistence pays. 3 months later, I got a response from Maria Marcos in Edison. I don't know why you're asking about my nephew Julio, but he's trouble. Stay away from him. Bingo, a relative. I wrote back immediately, explaining my situation, begging for any information that could help prove my innocence. She never responded, but at least I had confirmed Julio existed. Meanwhile, Kayla had become my investigator on the outside. She'd learned to file FOIA requests, obtaining police records I couldn't access from prison. What she found made my case even more frustrating. Dad, look at this, she said during a visit, sliding papers across the table. The police got 3 other tips about the Chen robbery. 3 people calling in about suspects that weren't you, but they stopped investigating after Mr. Chen picked your photo. 1 tip was particularly interesting. An anonymous caller had reported seeing a Hispanic male running from the direction of Chen's liquor around the time of the robbery. The caller described the suspect as wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, exactly what the robber wore. But the tip was logged and ignored because they already had their suspect, me. Can you find out who made that call? I asked. The report just says anonymous, but I'll keep digging. Carl helped me understand how to use this information. It's Brady material, he explained. Exculpatory evidence the prosecution should have disclosed. They gave you the report, but did they tell your lawyer about these other leads? Did they investigate them? The answer, discovered through more FOIA requests, was no. Detective Morrison, the cop not my lawyer, had noted in his file, additional tips received but not pursued. Suspect already identified by victim. This is huge, I told Carl. They had evidence pointing to other suspects and buried it. It's something, Carl agreed cautiously, but you need more. Courts don't like overturning convictions based on what investigations didn't do. You need positive proof. So I kept digging. I had Kayla track down former employees of Chen's Liquor. Most had moved on, but she found one, Dennis Park, who'd worked there until a month before the robbery. Dennis says Mr. Chen's eyesight was getting really bad, Kayla reported. He was too proud to wear his glasses in the store. Said it made him look old. Dennis said Chen once mistook a regular customer for a shoplifter because he couldn't see. Clearly another piece of the puzzle. But Dennis wouldn't sign an affidavit, too scared of getting involved, of contradicting his former boss's testimony. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ricky Valdez, the jailhouse snitch hood, testified against me, was back in Morgantown on a new charge. He was in protective custody, but prison has ways of delivering messages. I sent word through the inmate network. I wanted to talk, not to threaten or retaliate, just to talk. It took weeks, but finally Valdez agreed to meet in the law library. Under supervised conditions he looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by his lifestyle. What you want, Thompson? The truth? You lied at my trial. We both know it. He shrugged. Man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. They offered me a deal. What exactly did they offer? Valdez glanced at the guard, then leaned in. Dropped 2 charges. Recommended minimum sentence on the 3rd. All I had to do was say you confessed. Would you be willing to recant? Tell the truth now, he laughed bitterly. And catch a perjury charge. Add 5 years to my time? You dreaming? But I kept working on him. Every time our paths crossed, I'd remind him about the truth, about justice, about karma. I wasn't threatening, I was appealing to whatever conscience he might have left. Meanwhile, my investigation into Morrison's other cases was bearing fruit. Through the prison legal network, I connected with 3 other inmates who'd been represented by Morrison, all told similar stories. Sleeping during trial, missed deadlines, failure to investigate. 1. Jerome Williams, different Jerome than my witness, had successfully won a new trial after proving Morrison slept through his entire defense case. We should file a class action or something, Jerome suggested during a law library session. Get Morrison disbarred. I just want my freedom, I replied. Let someone else save the world. But the evidence was mounting. Morrison wasn't just incompetent, he was systematically failing his clients. I compiled a dossier of his failures, thinking it might strengthen my own appeal. The most painful part of the investigation was what it revealed about my own case. Kayla had managed to track down the vending machine guy, Jerome eyewitness, Not the inmate. He still had his route records from March 14, 2016, showing he was at Henderson Distribution. From 7:10 to 7:35 p.m., he remembered seeing me in the warehouse. I told that lawyer I'd testify, Jerome told Kayla. Gave him my number and everything. He never called. Another witness, Maria Gonzalez, had actually taken notes about that day because it was her daughter's birthday, and she was planning to leave early. Her notes showed me helping her move inventory at 7:15 p.m. She still had them, dated and everything. Why didn't you bring these to trial? Kayla asked her. Nobody told me to bring anything. The lawyer just asked if I saw Marcus that day. I said, yes. He didn't ask about proof or times or nothing. Each revelation was a knife in my gut. The evidence of my innocence had been there all along, waiting for a competent lawyer to present it. Instead, I got Morrison, and the evidence remained hidden while I went to prison. By year 3 of my sentence, I had a banker's box full of evidence Morrison had missed or ignored. Witness statements, time records, police reports, showing other suspects proof of Morrison's pattern of incompetence. Carl helped me organize it into a compelling narrative for my federal habeas petition. This is good work, he said, reviewing the final compilation. Better than most lawyers would do. And people have built a real case here. Think it's enough. Carl adjusted his broken glasses. In a just world, you'd be home tomorrow. In this world, you've given yourself a fighting chance. That's more than most of us get. I thought about all the hours spent writing letters. All of Kayla's weekends, spent tracking down witnesses, all the favors called in through the prison network to get information. 3 years of investigation from a concrete box, fighting a system designed to keep me inside. But I'd learned something important. The truth doesn't reveal itself. You have to dig for it, fight for it, refuse to let it stay buried. Morrison hadn't done that. The police hadn't done that. The prosecution certainly hadn't done that. So I did it myself, one letter at a time, one witness at a time, one piece of evidence at a time, building my case from behind bars, proving that even in chains, an innocent man can still search for justice. The investigation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was enough to show what everyone had missed. An innocent man had been convicted while the guilty one walked free. Now I just had to find someone who would listen. Year 6 of my sentence began with news that should have filled me with rage, but instead gave me hope. Morrison had been caught sleeping again, this time during a murder trial. The defendant's family had filmed it on a cell phone, and the video went viral. The headline in the Tribune read, "Public defender sleeps as client faces life sentence." The story exploded. Other Morrison clients came forward with similar stories. The Bar Association launched a formal investigation. Suddenly, James Morrison wasn't just my problem. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the public defender system. This is your moment, Carl told me, sliding the newspaper across the library table. Media attention changes everything. Courts that wouldn't listen before might listen now. I immediately wrote to the journalist who'd broken the story, Sandra Kim. Told her about my case, about the witnesses Morrison never called, about the evidence he'd slept through. Within a week, she was sitting across from me in the prison visiting. "Room, you have documentation of all this?" she asked, pen flying across her notepad. 3 boxers worth. My daughter has copies of everything. Sandra's investigation revealed the scope of Morrison's failures. In 15 years, he'd handled over 3,000 cases. By her count, at least 40 clients had credible claims of ineffective assistance based on his sleeping, drinking, or general incompetence. The man was a one-person miscarriage of justice, she told me during a follow-up visit. The question is why the system allowed it to continue for so long. Her series of articles put pressure on the authorities. The State Bar finally suspended Morrison pending a full investigation. The Public Defender's Office announced a review of all his cases, and most importantly for me, the Innocence Project of the state took notice. The letter came on a Tuesday. I'd written to them 3 times before, always rejected because I didn't have DNA evidence. But media attention has a way of opening doors. Dear Mr. Thompson, in light of recent revelations about your trial counsel's performance, we are willing to review your case. I read it 5 times before it sank in. The Innocence Project. Real lawyers. People who specialized in freeing the wrongfully convicted. They assigned me an attorney named David Chen, and yes, the irony wasn't lost on either of us. He was young, maybe early 30s, with the energy Morrison had lost decades ago. "I've reviewed your trial transcripts," he said during our first meeting. "It's appalling. Morrison's performance wasn't just ineffective, it was practically non-existent. Can you get me a new trial? I'm going to try. But first we need to investigate properly." Something Morrison never did. David was everything Morrison wasn't. He hired a private investigator to track down Julio Marcos. He subpoenaed records Morrison had ignored. He interviewed witnesses who had been waiting 6 years to tell their stories. The private investigator, a former cop named Mike Sullivan, found what the police hadn't bothered to look for: security footage from a gas station 2 blocks from Chun's Liquor, showing a Hispanic male matching Julio's description running past at 7:35 p.m. the night of the robbery. The footage had been saved on a backup drive the owner forgot about, This is huge, David told me, barely containing his excitement. We have footage of someone matching the anonymous tip description, running from the scene at the right time. Who isn't you? But the biggest break came from an unexpected source. Morrison himself, facing disbarment and desperate to save what was left of his reputation, agreed to provide an affidavit admitting his failures in my case. I was overwhelmed, overworked, and suffering from untreated sleep apnea and substance abuse issues, his affidavit read. I failed to provide Mr. Thompson with constitutionally adequate representation. I failed to investigate his alibi, failed to interview crucial witnesses, and was not fully conscious during significant portions of his trial. It was the admission we'd needed, but never thought we'd get. Morrison's own words confirming what I'd been saying for 6 years. David filed a motion for a new trial based on ineffective assistance of counsel and newly discovered evidence. This time, it wasn't a pro se filing from an inmate. It was a professionally crafted brief with exhibits, affidavits, and expert testimony about eyewitness misidentification. The state opposed it, of course. They argued I'd waited too long, that Morrison's problems were known during trial, that the new evidence didn't definitively prove innocence. But public opinion had shifted. Sandra Kim's articles had made my case a symbol of systemic failure. The hearing was set for December 15th. I'd appear in court for the first time since my sentencing. 6.5 years after being convicted for a crime I didn't commit, I'd finally get to present the defense Morrison had slept through. Don't get your hopes too high, David warned. Judges don't like overturning convictions. Even with everything we have, it's an uphill battle. But hope was all I had left. Hope and boxes of evidence that should have set me free years ago. The week before the hearing, Ricky Valdez sent word through the prison network. He wanted to talk. When we met in the library, he looked different. Older, tired, maybe finally worn down by the weight of his lies. I've been thinking, he said quietly, about karma and shit, about Judgment Day. What are you saying, Ricky? I'm saying maybe it's time I told the truth. I'm doing life anyway after my last beef. What they gonna do? Give me super life? He was willing to recant, to admit he'd lied about my confession in exchange for a deal. David was ecstatic when I told him, with Valdez's recantation, Morrison's admission, and the new evidence, we have a real shot, he said. The state's case is falling apart. As the hearing approached, media attention intensified. Sandra Kim interviewed Kayla, who spoke eloquently about watching her father be failed by the system meant to protect him. Former Morrison clients shared their stories. Legal experts debated the crisis in public defense. My case had become bigger than just me. It was about all the Marcus Thompsons sitting in prison because their lawyers were too overwhelmed, underfunded, or incompetent to fight for them. It was about a system that treated constitutional rights as suggestions rather than requirements. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep, not because my lawyer was incompetent this time, but because I finally had hope. Real hope, based on evidence and competent representation. Carl stopped by my cell. Tomorrow's the day. Huh, yeah, scared to death. Good fear means you still believe freedom is possible. It's when you stop being scared that you're truly imprisoned. I thought about Morrison, about how his failures had opened this crack in the system. His incompetence had been so egregious that it forced people to pay attention. In a twisted way, I was lucky. Most ineffective assistance is subtle, hard to prove. Mine had been caught snoring in open court. You did this, Carl said. You kept fighting when everyone else gave up. Whatever happens tomorrow, you remember that. But I didn't want moral victories. I wanted to go home. I wanted to hug my daughter without a guard watching. I wanted to wake up in my own bed and make my own breakfast and live the life that had been stolen from me. The crack in the system had let in some light. Tomorrow, we'd find out if it was enough to set me free. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., but at 7:47, David burst into the attorney interview room where I was waiting in my court clothes. The same suit Kayla had brought me 7 years ago, now loose on my prison-thinned frame. Marcus, you're not going to believe this? He said, breathless with excitement. Mike Sullivan found him. He found Julio Marcos. My heart stopped. What? He's been in federal custody for the last 18 months. Wire fraud case. Mike tracked him down through his attorney? And David paused, savoring the moment. He's willing to talk. The room spun. After years of chasing shadows, the real robber was suddenly within reach. He'll testify better. He already gave a sworn statement to Mike Marcus. He confessed. He admitted to robbing Chen's liquor. I broke down. 7 years of holding it together, of being strong for Kayla, of fighting. The system, it all came crashing down in tears of relief and rage and vindication. David showed me the statement. 3 pages of Julio Marcos admitting what I'd known all along. He'd robbed Chen's liquor on March 14, 2016. He'd worn a dark hoodie. He'd struck Chen with a silver-plated Colt .38 when the old man moved too slowly. He'd taken $3,200 and used it to pay off drug debts. I heard some other dude got popped for it. Julio's statement read. Felt bad about it sometimes, but I figured the system would sort it out. Guess I was wrong. Guess he was wrong. 7 years of my life for his wrong guess. Why is he talking now? I asked. He's looking at 20 years federal time. Figures cooperation might help at sentencing. Plus, David smiled grimly. Mike can be very persuasive. Reminded Julio that armed robbery has no statute of limitations. Better to confess now as a cooperating witness than get charged later. The confession was detailed. Specific, Julio knew. Things only the real robber would know. That Chen kept a baseball bat under the counter that he'd kicked away. That there was a hidden camera that didn't work. That Chen had been counting lottery tickets when he entered. The prosecution will argue Julio could have learned these details from news reports, David warned. But combined with everything else we have, the hearing became something different than we'd planned. Instead of just arguing ineffective assistance, we were presenting evidence of actual innocence. The real robber's confession, Morrison's incompetence, Valdez's recantation, the security footage showing someone else fleeing the scene. Walking into that courtroom was surreal. The same room where Morrison had slept through my conviction. The same judge who'd watched it happen. But this time, I had David Chen standing beside me, fully awake and fighting. The prosecution, led by Jennifer Walsh, now senior ADA, fought hard. She argued Julio's confession was unreliable, that he had nothing to lose by taking credit for an old crime. She questioned the chain of custody on the gas station footage. She painted Valdez as an unreliable witness, whether he was lying then or lying now. But David systematically destroyed each argument. He presented Julio's federal arrest records, showing he'd been picked up with $3,000 cash just 2 weeks after the robbery. He had the gas station owner testify about finding the footage. He put Morrison himself on the stand. Watching Morrison testify was painful. He looked destroyed, license suspended, career over, health broken. Part of me felt sorry. For him, most of me didn't. Mr. Morrison, David asked, were you fully conscious during Mr. Thompson's trial? No, Morrison admitted. I was suffering from severe sleep apnea and other issues. I fell asleep multiple times during crucial testimony. Did you investigate Mr. Thompson's alibi? Not adequately. No. Did you subpoena the security footage from his workplace? I intended to, but I never did. Each admission was another nail in the coffin of my conviction. But the real drama came when David called his final witness. The defense calls Julio, Marcos. The marshals brought him in orange jumpsuit, shackles, the whole package. He was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe favade, thin from federal lockup. He didn't look at me as he took the stand. David walked him through it step by step. The planning, the robbery, the assault on Chen. Julio spoke quietly but clearly, describing exactly how he'd committed the crime I'd been convicted of. Mr. Chen was an easy target, he said. Old man, alone in the store at night. I needed quick cash for my supplier. Figured he'd have at least a few grand from lottery sales. Did you know Marcus Thompson was arrested for this crime? David asked. Not his name, but I heard some black dude got picked up for it. I was already in Houston by then. Did you feel any responsibility? Julio shrugged. Not my problem. I figured if he didn't do it, they'd figure it out. They'd figure it out. The casual cruelty of it made me want to scream. My life destroyed because everyone assumed someone else would figure it out. Walsh's cross-examination was brutal. She got Julio to admit he was hoping for leniency on his federal charges. She pointed out inconsistencies between his statement and the trial record. She suggested he'd studied the case to make his confession believable, but she couldn't shake the core fact. Julio knew details that hadn't been public, that only the real robber would know. The hearing lasted 2 days. 2 days to undo 7 years of injustice. When both sides rested, Judge Hawkins said she'd take it under advisement. How long? I asked David. Could be days, could be months. But Marcus, he gripped my shoulder. We did everything we could. The truth is finally out there. Back in my cell, I thought about Julio Marcos. How different our lives had been since that night in March 2016. He'd spent the money, lived free for years, committed more crimes. I'd been in a cage, learning law, fighting for freedom. In a strange way, I owed him a debt. If he hadn't confessed, I'd still be just another inmate, claiming innocence. His words had done what all my protests couldn't, proved I was telling the truth. Carl stopped by that evening, heard it went well. We'll see. Judge Hawkins let it happen in the first place. Not sure she'll admit she was wrong. Sometimes, the system surprises you, Carl said. Not often, but sometimes. 3 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday morning, the decision came down. I was in the library when the counselor found me. Thompson, your lawyer's on the phone, says it's urgent. I could barely hold the receiver. My hands were shaking so bad. Marcus David's voice was thick with emotion. Are you sitting down? Just tell me. Motion granted. New trial ordered. The judge found that Morrison's performance was constitutionally deficient, and that the new evidence raises substantial doubt about your guilt. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. New trial. The words I'd dreamed of for 7 years. Marcus, you there? Yeah, I managed. What happens now? Now the prosecution has to decide whether to retry you. Given Julio's confession and everything else, I'd be shocked if they do. Marcus, you're going to go home. Home. After 7 years, 3 months, and 11 days. I was going to go home. The real robber had finally been revealed, not through brilliant police work or prosecutorial diligence, but through the persistence of an imprisoned man who refused to accept injustice, a daughter who never stopped believing, and a twist of fate that put Julio Marcos in federal custody. Justice delayed, justice denied, they say. But sometimes, if you fight long enough and hard enough, justice delayed is still justice delivered, even if it comes 7 years too late. The prosecution had 30 days to decide whether to retry me, 30 days that felt longer than the 7 years I'd already served. David was optimistic. How could they retry a case where the real perpetrator had confessed? But I'd learned not to underestimate the system's reluctance to admit mistakes. Jennifer Walsh personally called David on day 12. "We need to talk," she said. "Can you come to my office?" David told me later it was one of the strangest meetings of his career. Walsh, the prosecutor who'd fought so hard to convict me, sat across from him looking exhausted. "I've reviewed everything," she said. "Julio Marcus's confession, the gas station footage, Morrison's admissions. I've also reviewed the original case file, and Henye found something troubling. There were notes in the file about the anonymous tip, the one about a Hispanic male fleeing the scene. The notes suggested following up, but there's no indication anyone did." David stayed quiet, letting her talk. "I believe in the system," Walsh continued. "I believe we get it right most of the time, but this case, we failed Mr. Thompson. I failed him." It was as close to an apology as the system would offer. Walsh recommended to her superiors that charges be dropped, but there was a process, reviews, meetings, bureaucracy, grinding slowly toward justice. Meanwhile, I waited in my cell, caught between hope and fear. Other inmates who'd been through the appeal process warned me not to celebrate too early. "System don't like letting go," my cellmate said, "even when they know they're wrong." Day 25, David visited with news. "The DA wants to make a deal. They'll drop charges if you agree not to sue for wrongful conviction."
What?
They're worried about liability. 7 years of wrongful imprisonment, with Morrison's incompetence and their failure to investigate other leads, you could sue for millions. As if money could buy back 7 years of Kayla's life without her father. As if it could restore the career I'd lost, the relationships that had withered, the piece of my soul that prison had carved away. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Take the deal. Get out first. Then we'll figure out the civil suit. They can't make you sign away your rights as a condition of release. That would be unconstitutional." "You sure I'm sure? Let's get you home, Marcus." On day 28, the state formally moved to dismiss all charges. In light of newly discovered evidence and questions about the integrity of the original trial, the motion read, "No admission of error, no acknowledgement that they'd convicted an innocent man, just bureaucratic language designed to minimize liability." Judge Hawkins granted the motion immediately. After 7 years, 3 months, and 26 days, I was legally innocent again. Or rather, I was back to what I'd always been, not guilty of robbing Chun's liquor. But freedom doesn't come immediately in prison. There's paperwork, processing, procedures. I spent 3 more days in limbo, technically free, but still behind bars. Carl helped me pack my few possessions, legal books, letters from Kayla, the boxes of evidence that had finally saved me. "What you gonna do out there?" he asked. "Live? Just live? Maybe help other guys like us?" "The world needs more jailhouse lawyers on the outside," he said. "Don't forget us in here. Never." The morning of my release, I gave away everything I couldn't carry. My radio went to a young kid just starting a 10-year sentence. My legal books went to the library. My commissary food went to guys who'd looked out for me over the years. I walked to R&D receiving and discharge in my stat-tissued clothing, carrying a single box of letters and legal papers. They gave me my property from 7 years ago, wallet with $47, keys to an apartment I no longer had, a cell phone so outdated it looked like an artifact. "Transportation?" the officer asked. "My daughter's picking me up." They gave me $40 gate money and had me sign a dozen forms. Then the inner door opened, then the middle gate, then the final barrier, and then I was standing outside the walls of Morgantown Correctional Facility, breathing free air for the first time in 7 years. Kayla was waiting in the parking lot, standing beside a car I didn't recognize. My baby girl, now 26, a woman who'd spent her entire adult life fighting for her father's freedom. She ran to me, and I caught her in a hug that tried to make up for 7 years of plexiglass barriers. We both cried, standing there in the prison parking lot, holding each other like we might disappear if we let go. "Let's go home, Dad," she finally said. "Where's home?" "I got us an apartment. It's small, but it's ours. I've been saving." As we drove away, I watched the prison shrink in the side mirror. 7 years of my life contained in those concrete walls. 7 years stolen by James Morrison's incompetence, the prosecution's tunnel vision, and a system more interested in convictions than truth. But I was free. Julio Marcos was facing federal time plus state charges for the robbery. Morrison was disbarred and facing civil suits from multiple clients. The public defender's office was under federal oversight. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. There's something else, Kayla said as we hit the highway. That journalist, Sandra Kim? She wants to write a book about your case. And the Innocence Project wants you to speak at their fundraiser. I just want to be quiet for a while, I said. Just want to be normal. But I knew normal was gone forever. You don't spend 7 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit and come out the same person. The Marcus Thompson who'd been arrested that March morning was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone who understood the law and its failures. Someone who'd learned that justice isn't given, it's taken. The sun was setting as we reached the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there, Morrison was probably sleeping. Walsh was probably preparing for her next trial. Judge Hawkins was probably presiding over another case. And I was finally going home. The apartment Kayla had found was in a different neighborhood than our old one. That life was gone. Auctioned off when I couldn't pay rent from prison. This was smaller, a 1-bedroom in a converted house, but it was clean and bright and had something I'd dreamed about for 7 years. A door I could open whenever I wanted. That first night of freedom. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected to hear the count bell, the clang of metal doors, someone screaming down the tier. Instead, there was traffic noise, a dog barking somewhere, normal city sounds that seemed impossibly exotic. At 3 a.m., gave up and made coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter institutional brew I'd grown used to. I sat at Kayla's small kitchen table looking at the pile of mail she'd saved, letters from supporters who'd read about my case, bills from lawyers I couldn't afford. I noticed that my driver's license had expired 5 years ago. Couldn't sleep. Kayla emerged from the bedroom she'd given up for me, wrapped in a robe that made her look like the teenager I'd left behind. It's too quiet, I admitted. Stupid, right? Complained about the noise for 7 years, and now? Dr. Martinez said it would take time. The therapist the Innocence Project recommended. She said most exonerees struggle with adjustment. Ex-honoree. That's what I was now. Not an ex-con, but an ex-honoree. A person the system had failed so spectacularly that they needed a special word for it. Over the next days, I learned how much the world had changed. Smartphones were everywhere. Kayla had to teach me how to use one. People ordered groceries online. My old job was gone. Henderson Distribution bought out and closed. Most of my friends had moved on, unsure how to talk to someone who'd been wrongly imprisoned, but there were bright spots. Ray Jimenez, my old supervisor, reached out through Kayla. He was working at a new warehouse and thought he could get me an interview. Maria Gonzalez sent a card welcoming me home. Even Jerome, the vending machine guy, called to say he was sorry the system had failed me. The hardest part was the anger. It would hit at random moments, seeing a police car, hearing about a trial on the news, even just remembering Morrison's sleeping face. 7 years of my life, gone. Kayla's college years, experienced through collect calls and visiting room conversations. My mother had died while I was inside, and I'd had to watch her funeral on a prison TV because they wouldn't grant me compassionate release. You have to let it go, Kayla urged, during one of my rage spirals. The anger will eat you alive. How do I let go of 7 years? By making the next 7 count? She was right, of course. This wise woman who'd grown up while I was gone, who'd fought for me when everyone else had given up. But knowing and doing were different things. David Chen called with updates on the civil suit. The city was offering a settlement $50,000 per year of wrongful incarceration, plus legal fees. That's $350,000, he said. It's not enough for what you went through, but trials are risky. Juries sometimes think any money is too much for ex-prisoners, even innocent ones. Blood money, I thought. But Kayla had spent her college savings fighting for me. She deserved to go back to school, and maybe I could help other wrongfully convicted prisoners. Take it, I decided. The check came 2 weeks later. After legal fees and taxes, it was enough to pay off Kayla's debts, put her through college, and have some left over. I stared at it for a long time. My life reduced to a dollar amount, my suffering converted to currency, but it was also freedom of a different kind. Freedom from immediate financial worry. Freedom to choose what came next. Instead of taking the first job available, Sandra Kim interviewed me for her book, spending hours recording my story. It was exhausting, reliving every moment, but also cathartic. Someone was finally listening, really listening, to everything that had gone wrong. Morrison's not the only one, she told me. I've found dozens of cases like yours across the state. Public defenders sleeping, drunk, unprepared. The system is broken. So what do? We tell the stories. We demand change. We make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I thought about Carl, still inside, still teaching other inmates to fight. About all the Marcus Thompsons sitting in cells because their lawyers failed them. Maybe that was my purpose now, too. Be a voice for the voiceless. The Innocence Project event was my first public speaking engagement. Standing at that podium, looking out at a room full of lawyers and donors, I almost fled. But then I saw Kayla in the front row, smiling encouragingly, and I found my voice. I told them about Morrison sleeping while my life hung in the balance, about the witnesses never called, the evidence never presented, about learning law in a prison library because the lawyer provided to me couldn't stay awake. About Julio Marcos walking free while I served his time. The Constitution promises effective assistance of counsel, I concluded. Not perfect, but effective. What I got wasn't even conscious assistance. How many others are sitting in prison right now because their lawyers failed them? How many innocent people are behind bars because the system sees them as case numbers instead of human beings? The applause was thunderous, but what mattered more were the lawyers who approached afterward, promising to do better, to remember that their clients' lives depended on their diligence. As I walked out of that hotel ballroom, Kayla by my side, I felt something I hadn't felt in 7 years. Purpose. I wasn't just Marcus Thompson, wrongfully convicted. I was Marcus Thompson, survivor and advocate. The city lights sparkled around us as we headed home. Somewhere, a siren wailed, police or ambulance. I couldn't tell. Once, that sound would have sent me into flashbacks of my arrest. Now it was just city noise, life going on. You did good, Dad, Kayla said. Mom would be proud. I hope so. We walked in comfortable silence, father and daughter, survivors of a system that had tried to destroy our family and failed. Tomorrow there would be more challenges, job interviews, therapy sessions, the daily struggle of rebuilding a life. But tonight, I was free. I was with my daughter, and I was finally telling my truth. 7 years, 3 months, and 26 days. That's what the system stole from me. The rest of my life, that's what I was taking back. 1 year after my release, I stood in front of the state legislature, testifying in support of a bill that would require recording of all interrogations and lineup procedures. The same building where laws were made that had failed to protect me now echoed with my voice demanding change. Eyewitness misidentification is the leading cause of wrongful convictions, I told the Judiciary Committee. Mr. Chen was traumatized, without his glasses, and desperate to identify his attacker. The police showed him photos until he picked one that looked close enough. That's not justice. That's a guess that cost me 7 years. The committee members shifted uncomfortably. Change is hard when it means admitting the system you've built is flawed. But I wasn't alone anymore. Sandra Kim's book, Sleeping Justice, the Marcus Thompson story, had become a bestseller. Other Morrison clients had come forward. The movement for criminal justice reform had found in my case a perfect storm of everything wrong with the system. Morrison himself had become an unexpected ally. Disbarred and in recovery, he'd reached out through David Chen 6 months after my release. I need to apologize, he'd said when we met at a coffee shop, his hand steady now without the alcohol and pills. I failed you. I failed dozens of clients. I was drowning, and I took you down with me. Why didn't you quit? I asked. If you couldn't handle the caseload, why keep taking cases? Because someone had to. You know how many public defenders this state has? Not enough for half the cases. If I quit, those clients get no one. I thought bad representation was better than none. He laughed bitterly. I was wrong. Now Morrison traveled with me sometimes, speaking to law schools about the crisis in public defense. The man who'd slept through my trial was wide awake to the systemic failures that had allowed it to happen. The civil lawsuit against the state had opened doors I never expected. With the settlement money, I'd established the Marcus Thompson Justice Fund, providing grants to inmates seeking post-conviction representation. Carl was our first recipient, using the funds to hire a lawyer who found issues in his case the 22 years of pro se filings had missed. You're giving us hope, Carl wrote from prison. That's more valuable than the money. Kayla had returned to school, studying criminal justice with a focus on wrongful convictions. Someone needs to fix this system from the inside, she'd said. Might as well be someone who knows firsthand how broken it is. My job at the warehouse paid the bills, but my real work happened after hours. Speaking engagements, consulting with attorneys on ineffective assistance claims, visiting prisons to teach what I'd learned in the law library. I'd become what Carl had predicted, a jailhouse lawyer on the outside. The hardest speech was at Chun's Liquor. Mr. Chun had reached out through Sandra, wanting to meet. I'd resisted for months, anger and resentment burning too hot. But finally, curiosity won. The store looked smaller than I'd imagined. Mr. Chen, now in his 70s, stood behind the same counter where he'd been robbed. His hand shook as he poured tea in the back office. I'm sorry, he said simply. I was so sure. The police showed me pictures and I was so angry, so scared. I wanted someone to pay, and I did. 7 years. I know. I read the book, saw the news. I was wrong. He pulled out a worn newspaper clipping my release photo. I keep this, to remind myself. My certainty destroyed your life. I wanted to rage at him, to make him understand what his mistake had cost. But looking at this old man, haunted by his mistake, I found something I hadn't expected. Forgiveness. Not for the system that had failed us both, but for a frightened victim who'd been failed by that system too. The police should have investigated more, I said finally. Should have looked at other suspects, tested the evidence properly. You identified who they wanted you to identify. We talked for 2 hours. About trauma and memory. About justice and mistakes. About moving forward when the past couldn't be changed. When I left, we shook hands to victims of a crime that had destroyed multiple lives. The legislative hearing continued for 3 hours. Prosecutors argued against the reforms, claiming they would make convictions harder to obtain. Defense attorneys argued they didn't go far enough. Politicians calculated votes and campaign contributions. But then Kayla took the stand. My daughter, poised and professional, speaking with the authority of someone who'd lived the consequences of systemic failure. My father missed my high school graduation because of a wrongful conviction, she said. He missed my first day of college because I never went, too busy fighting for his freedom. He missed 7 years of my life because the system valued quick convictions over truth. How many other daughters are missing their fathers right now for the same reason? The bill passed committee 7-3, small victory, but victory nonetheless. That night, we celebrated at Ray Jimenez's house. My old supervisor had become a close friend again, one of the few who treated me as Marcus, not the wrongfully convicted guy. His wife Maria, different Maria than my former coworker, had cooked enough food for an army. Remember when you used to complain about inventory nights? Ray asked, laughing. Bet you wish you could complain about them now. Every day? I admitted. I dream about normal problems, traffic jams and overtime and bills. But normal was still elusive. PTSD from prison made crowds difficult. Nightmares woke me most nights. Relationships were almost impossible. How do you explain 7 stolen years on a first date? Still, there was progress. The bill passed the full legislature 2 months later. Not everything we'd wanted, but requiring recorded interrogations was a start. Other states were watching, considering similar reforms. Morrison and I did a joint interview on 60 Minutes, the sleeping lawyer and his innocent client, together again under very different circumstances. He was sober now, working with law students on understanding the signs of burnout. I was free, using my voice for those still trapped. The system failed both of us, Morrison said during the interview. Failed Marcus by convicting him. Failed me by letting me destroy lives while impaired. We need public defenders who are funded, supported, and held accountable. The interview aired to millions. Emails poured in from inmates claiming innocence. Families seeking help, lawyers offering pro bono assistance. The Marcus Thompson Justice Fund grew, helping more inmates access real representation. But the best moment came a 1.5 years after my release. Carl walked out of Morgantown, his sentence reduced after proving prosecutorial misconduct in his original trial. I was there to meet him, just as Kayla had met me. How's freedom? I asked as we drove away. Terrifying, he admitted. But good, terrifying, I understood. Freedom after injustice isn't simple. It's complicated by anger, by lost time, by the knowledge that the system that failed you is still failing others. But it's still freedom. Today, 3 years after my release, I continue the fight. The warehouse job is gone. The Justice Fund is my full-time work now. We've helped 17 inmates prove ineffective assistance of counsel. 3 have been exonerated completely. Morrison still sleeps. But it's the rest of the recovered, not the escape of the addicted. He works tirelessly for reform, his failure becoming his purpose. Kayla graduates law school next year. She's already clerking for a judge who specializes in post-conviction relief. My daughter, the lawyer, fighting the system that stole her father, and, somewhere, Julio Marcos serves his time. Federal sentence running concurrent with state charges for the robbery he finally admitted to. He wrote me once, a rambling apology that I couldn't finish reading. Some forgiveness is beyond me. The system that wrongfully convicted me is still broken. Public defenders are still overworked. Eyewitness identifications are still unreliable. Innocent people still go to prison while the guilty go free. But now there are more of us fighting. Every ex-NRE who speaks out, every lawyer who remembers their obligation, every legislator who votes for reform, we're all chipping away at the machine that values convictions over truth. I think about that morning in March 2016, when police knocked on my door and destroyed my life. I think about Morrison sleeping while my freedom slipped away. I think about 7 years in a cage for another man's crime. Then I think about Kayla's law school acceptance letter. Carl's freedom. 17 inmates who got real representation because of our fund. Small victories against a massive system, but victories nonetheless. The work continues. Every day someone sits in a cell for a crime they didn't commit. Every day an overworked public defender fails their client. Every day, the system chooses efficiency over justice. But also, every day, we fight back. We tell our stories. We demand better. We refuse to let the system forget its failures. My name is Marcus Thompson. I spent 7 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit because my lawyer slept through my trial. But I'm awake now, wide awake. And I'm not going back to sleep until the system that failed me is fixed. That's my promise to everyone still inside. Still fighting, still hoping. Justice may sleep sometimes, but it doesn't have to sleep forever. Not if we keep shaking it awake.